Greetings shippers, welcome back, and it's time to do an update on one of the first ships that we covered on this channel. Well, first-ish, because things have been changing within that fandom. So suddenly, there's a lot more stuff to talk about, which happens a lot with shipping and fandom, because things are always evolving and always changing. So there has begun to be a divide in this pairing of late that actually began a while ago, but the confusion around it and what exactly is going on has recently hit all-time highs. So it's time to look back at a Marvel shipping favorite, that being Spideypool, the pairing of Deadpool and Spider-Man, a pairing that predates the explosion of popularity of the MCU. Now, a lot has happened for these characters both separately and together since we last discussed these two. The Spider-Man and Deadpool team-up comic is still going strong, there is the much-lauded Andrew Garfield and Ryan Reynolds kiss, and of course there has been the extremely well-received Spider-Man Homecoming and the mostly well-received Deadpool 2. So what does all of this have to do with Spideypool? Well, get ready, because we're about to break it down. But first, as always, be sure to follow on social media to stay up to date with what we're working on, and of course be informed when we go live. We do all kinds of things live. Chat, play games, it is a good time. And now, without further ado, let's take a look at Spideypool. We already discussed the genesis of this pairing way back in 2016, so if you missed it, you can of course click the card or the link will be down below, for we shall not be going back over most of the basics. Instead, let us jump forward to the controversy currently plaguing the shipping fandom. Now, there have always been whispers of this, the idea that Deadpool was/is too old for Peter Parker. However, while the ship lived mostly in the comic domain, this was less of an issue, as not only has Peter been an adult there for decades, but comic fans are quite used to being stuck with their favorite internal headcanons vis-a-vis characters' ages, as comics are so often rebooting/resetting characters only to let them get back to where they were, and then resetting them again. However, with the rise of the superhero film genre, as well as the rise of fanvid culture and wider mainstream access and appeal of shipping in general, Spideypool began to branch out. There began to be man-ups involving at the time Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, as Garfield became Spider-Man during the solidification of gift sets as a way to share narratives in fandom, this being the late 2000s, early 2010s. Alongside Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool, as post-X-Men Origins Wolverine, Ryan Reynolds had been quite vocal about wanting to play the character, but to play the character correctly in an R-rated film. All of this was also coinciding with the success of the MCU, as in 2012 The Avengers was released, proving that the gamble of creating a large film universe wherein each film built upon the other was paying off, which meant that while this pairing was extremely popular, it was also being given a great deal of access in arenas that it hadn't been before, as one was contending with an ease of access to various comics as well as these exploding film verses. The Avengers film, the Amazing Spider-Man film, an eager Reynolds to play Deadpool, and a fandom culture to produce a wide array of works from fics to vids. Everything was lining up for Spideypool. Just 2 years later in 2014, the heavily critiqued Amazing Spider-Man 2 would be released, and also the R-rated Deadpool test footage starring Ryan Reynolds would leak. All of this served to bolster and create a new era of Spideypool shippers, those drawn to or hoping for a film version, not even necessarily a canon where these two were together, but simply where they both existed in one universe. The man-ups and the like increased. As for why people were hoping for this shared universe, it was not only because this was occurring in the comics, but because in the film world, Deadpool and Spider-Man are owned by separate media entities, and there are those who wanted and still do want a complete combined universe on screen. As a result, in fandom, a fusion took place in many corners. For some in the fic world, it had long been going on, creating intricate canons that combined the MCU and the comic verse, or verses, a practice that still occurs, but it is also now just as likely to find fics solely focused on the MCU, as at this point it has firmly established itself as its own universe. This combination also extended to the visual side of transformative fandom, so the concept of, say, the super family, that being Tony and Steve in a relationship, and having a son, Peter Parker, a concept that was going strong for the comics that was also coupled with a trope of their son, Spider-Man, dating Wade Wilson, could now be represented with all of the actors in question, pulling from a variety of works to create intriguing representations of various domestic scenarios, as well as intricate fan vids. As for the age difference argument, then again, while there was some concern, it is nowhere near the amount it is at the time of this recording, though it could be just as fervent. However, during that time, many argued that they were still working with the comic versions of the characters, but using the actors to represent them, while others argued that Garfield's Spider-Man was old enough to be with Deadpool, or others subtly aged him up, while others still felt that the relationship really had other issues to contend with if one was going to be against it. So what happened to cause such a large shift within a significant segment of the fandom? Well, as with most things in fandom, it may seem to be one thing, but it is in reality multiple different factors. However, in this case, the most obvious catalyst for many was the casting of Tom Holland as Spider-Man in 2016's Captain America Civil War. Now, Holland is quite noticeably a younger interpretation of Spider-Man, and for many this caused a shift in how they viewed Spideypool, and it arose in a variety of ways. It is also here that the divide could be seen to fully widen, as in the same year, 2016, the Spider-Man Deadpool team-up comic launched, branching off and creating a completely different comic book canon that in itself became extremely popular with comic fans and shippers. For some, even if they were comic fans, the film versions of Deadpool and now MCU Spider-Man, either one or both had come to be how they viewed the characters. As a result, these new ages were cemented within their own headcanons as well, and the gap was too large and made them uncomfortable. As some shippers do not like to step outside of canon when it comes to their pairings, and like to be informed by the knowledge presented within the text, at least the text with which they are familiar. And while some may use the argument why not age them up, certain shippers do not enjoy making what they view as large canonical changes. As if one took the ages from the MCU and then the Deadpool verse, it would indeed be questionable. For others, these versions had been their only encounters with the characters, especially Spider-Man, who pre-MCU was one of Marvel's most adapted characters. So people were familiar with these versions, but perhaps not others, as the MCU had tried and succeeded to bring in a wide array of fans from the mainstream, some of whom, while tangentially aware of the comic book culture, were not involved in it, and as a result, thought this was a direct representation of the characters' ages, and hence all Spideypool shippers were questionable. Even for those who were aware of other Spider-Men, Andrew Garfield's portrayal is very polarizing, as many wish to believe that the Amazing Spider-Man series simply did not exist, and as a result, Holland came to overtake Garfield in a much easier way than Garfield came to overtake Maguire. Though there are of course those who love all the portrayals, or feel that they each work for their own time, and many are excited to see the way that the character has evolved and the ways that people can honor these past portrayals. Others felt that since some would argue these portrayals are the more popular and hence more widespread, they should be given more weight than the comic verse, and that Spideypool shippers should stop in deference to the film canon. And of course there is the other side, as the Spideypool Agegate incident has led to showing off some of fandom's darker underbellies for all involved, such as has already been seen above fandom gatekeeping, but this comes in many forms and will be continued below, such as the idea of authenticity. Some fans feel that movie fans are less authentic than either dual fans, those being fans of the films and the comics, or pure comic book fans, as many feel that every single film adaptation is terrible. Others feel it is unfair to judge an entire group after seeing, say, a piece of fan art if one has no knowledge of the canon outside of the films. For a time, certain shippers responded by changing up the tags of their works, adding such tags as Andrew Garfield is my Spider-Man, in an effort to let other fans know they were not dealing in underage fiction, while some deemed this unnecessary as they felt if others did not know the ins and outs of various canons, then so be it, and that they were already tagging their works with other what they deemed more relevant tags. This also went for Spideypool shippers who were not using Andrew Garfield as their Spider-Man, but instead one of the comic versions. Some felt it was fine to disregard such tags, especially for these characters, as Spider-Man and Deadpool, especially Spider-Man, have various versions across the comic verse, including the multiverse, film adaptations, comic adaptations, video games, cartoons, and more. So really, fans could be working with many different versions of the character, and for people to simply assume the worst was disingenuous, while others always age up their Peter, or are already working with an age-appropriate one. But for some, they feel they don't have to, as they are operating in a fictive space where one is free to explore any and all ideas. Others argue that if one adhered to canon, be it film or comic, no one would ever be able to produce anything, as especially in comics the canon is always changing so rapidly that one would become quickly out of date. For example, in the latest issue of Spider-Man Deadpool team-up at the time of this recording, the Spider-Man in question is the geriatric Old Man Parker, as the success of Old Man Logan has led to a variety of old such-and-such character turns. Even so, the comments persist. Some blame what they view as brewing toxicity between the shipping community and its antis as arising for a variety of reasons. One, the rigidity of fandom rhetoric, that being both fans and antis talking in absolutes, leaving not only little room for conversation, but also creating friction due to a clear unwillingness to see or even entertain another viewpoint. The assumption of either stupidity or deviance in the fan in question, and at times a lack of demonstration of fandom knowledge that leads to the entire group being dismissed. And this can be the more traditional lack of knowledge as people normally imagine it, that being canon knowledge, or it can actually be a lack of knowledge about fandom and the ins and outs of how the various facets function. For example, a statement such as Spider-Man has always been 15, you are gross, takes away from the fact that some who are opposed are genuinely concerned about the propagation of grooming material, by demonstrating that the position is not a fully informed one, while read a comic has an aura of dismissal and elitism, and as a result, many who are in the middle can be lost. For example, there are those who acknowledge that there is a completely different comic canon out there, but they are still not comfortable with it, as they can acknowledge that both of these canons exist, and that for them the idea that underage Peter is potentially paired with Deadpool at all is simply too much. Others feel that there has been a shift in fandom of late over the last several years towards hyper-morality, that being not a genuine morality, but rather one born of virtue signaling or fear of being labeled as problematic, as in certain fandoms, age gaps as small as 2 years are labeled as pedophilia. Some do it facetiously, but others are genuine. Some attribute this to either a rise in fandom visibility or a shift in where fandom occurs, or simply a shift in discourse in general, and how it is reported on, or the news surrounding it. And alas, when it comes to fandom, this is usually negative. And of course, it must be said, Tumblr is not the only place fandom is practiced, as fandom is not a monolith. The same goes for Twitter or Reddit, all of which are known as hubs for becoming echo chambers or fandom policing. So what does all of this mean for Spideypool? Well, it does mean that some will simply steer clear, or prejudge the ship based on comments they have seen, or their own age base, which of course is fine. Not everyone has to ship the same thing, and if the age difference is too much and that is the canon one adheres to, one doesn't have to change for another canon one is less attached to, as most fans will have a canon that appeals to them more than others, especially in evolving fandoms such as these where new material is constantly being added. And it is fully possible to be familiar with a character without ever having to go back to the base source material of the comics. Of course, the flip side to this is that sadly there are some who will simply stay away because they are afraid and do not want to get involved in any of the drama. It must also be noted that not everyone stays in fandom actively forever. For some, there is only one foray. So for example, the Spider-Man Deadpool crossover comic, or the MCU is all they will experience, and that is fine too. There are many different types of fans, and one is not better than the other, despite what fandom hierarchies would have you believe. This statement, of course, does not include those who harass or go above and beyond to make either other fans or creators' lives miserable, as that is simply never appropriate for anyone. As for assumptions about Spideypool, the problem as always arises due to closed minds and an inability or unwillingness to assume genuine intent in other fans. Fandom is at its best when members are respectful and disagreements are conducted thoughtfully. Not all sides will agree, but it does not mean that other sides and viewpoints must be destroyed, especially in a case such as this where there is so clearly a wide breadth of shipping happening that has nothing to do with the concern raised. Also, the age in question is always subject to change. For example, the video game Peter Parker of 2018's E3 Spider-Man game is 23. For a time in comics, Spider-Man was almost 30. And of course, the MCU currently, he's 16. As for Spideypool's future, who can say? The ship is still very much alive though, especially in comic fandom. Though of course, it's always one Parker reboot away from changing. And with how often Spider-Man is rebooted in the filmverse, the world may soon see another Peter before they know it. Or want it. As always, ship and let ship, and perhaps take a step back and explore other canons and potentials before assuming the worst in one's fellow fans. Fandom is fraught enough these days. And that is how an update can end up being longer than the original shipping vid. Well, you know, most of my first videos were short, and now I look back and I'm like, how? Anyways, as always, now it is question time. Are you guys Spideypool shippers? Have you noticed a shift in how the ship is perceived? Did the casting of Tom Holland make you stop shipping it? As always, you know the drill. As many answers as possible, and of course, number them too if you can. Also, a huge thank you for everyone spending some time shipping with me today and sticking with me while I bring out all kinds of new content for you guys. From fanversations to streams to the regular ship videos to headcanon theater, there is just so much fandom to talk about. So much. Too many fandoms, too little time. So, until next time, let us get to the outro. Bye-bye. This has been Shipper's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Special thanks to all of my patrons, names on the side, and as always, stay tuned, for there are as many ships out there as there are stars in the sky.